What happens when a soldier searching for meaning and a war dog scarred by the past cross paths in the most unexpected way? Daniel Hart, a veteran battling the weight of trauma, walks into a small animal shelter one evening, not knowing his life is about to change. In the back corner of the shelter lies Max, a German shepherd whose haunted eyes mirror Daniel's own struggles. But Max isn't just any dog. He's Daniel's former partner from the battlefield. Yet heartbreakingly, Max doesn't recognize him. Can the bond they once shared be restored? Will they help each other heal from the wounds of war? This is a story of loyalty, love, and second chances you won't want to miss. If you're ready to be inspired by the unbreakable connection between a man and his dog, hit like and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss this incredible journey of redemption and hope. The golden hues of the Arizona sunset spilled across the landscape, casting long shadows over the desert town. Daniel Hart, a 37-year-old veteran, walked slowly along the cracked pavement toward the small animal shelter nestled at the edge of town. His worn boots scuffed against the ground, a quiet rhythm to his solitary journey. Each step carried the weight of his memories that felt heavier since he had left the army 2 years ago. Life after service had been an uphill battle. The structure, purpose, and camaraderie of military life were gone, leaving behind a hollow emptiness that no job or therapy seemed to fill. He had tried carpentry, then a brief stint as a mechanic, but nothing clicked. His nights were restless, filled with echoes of missions past, and his days were unmoored, drifting aimlessly through the routines of civilian life. The only constant was a longing he couldn't quite name until now. The shelter came into view, a modest structure with rusty fences and faded signage. Daniel hesitated at the gate, his heart heavy with doubt. He was here at the urging of his sister, Grace, whose relentless optimism was both a comfort and an irritant. "A dog might help," she had said, her voice firm yet kind. "You always talked about how much Leo meant to you. Maybe it's time to let another dog into your life." Leo. The name alone sent a pang through Daniel's chest. His German shepherd partner had been more than a dog. He'd been family, a loyal presence in the chaos of war. But Leo had been retired due to injuries and rehomed while Daniel was still in recovery. He hadn't seen him since, and the void left behind felt insurmountable. The thought of finding another companion felt both hopeful and disloyal, but something deeper, a quiet nudge from within, had finally urged him to take this step. Daniel pushed the gate open, the creak of the hinges cutting through the quiet evening. The shelter was small, its humble setup a mix of makeshift kennels and improvised play areas. The air smelled of disinfectant, tinged with the earthy musk of dogs. Scattered barks echoed from various enclosures, some eager and others melancholy. A young staff member approached him with a warm smile. "Mr. Hart, thanks for stopping by," she greeted him. "I'm Megan, let me show you around." Daniel nodded, following her as she led him down narrow aisles lined with chain-link fences. Inside each cage, dogs of various breeds and sizes either barked eagerly or watched silently as they passed. Megan pointed out a few with kind words highlighting their personalities, but none struck a chord with Daniel. He wanted to feel that spark, that undeniable connection, and so far it eluded him. They reached the last row of kennels, and Daniel was ready to give up when Megan paused. "Actually, there's one more I think you should see," she said, her voice thoughtful. "He's different. Been through a lot. Like you." Intrigued, Daniel followed her to a quieter, secluded section of the shelter. She stopped in front of a cage tucked away in the corner. Inside, lying in the shadows, was a large German shepherd. His black and tan coat was marred by scars, and his posture was stiff, almost wary. His head rested on his paws, his ears twitching slightly at their presence, but he didn't lift his gaze. "This is Max," Megan said softly. "He came to us from another shelter a few weeks ago. They said he was surrendered by someone who couldn't handle him. He's been reserved. Doesn't trust people easily." Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he took a closer look. There was something familiar in Max's frame, in the slope of his shoulders and the set of his jaw. His heart began to pound, memories flooding back in vivid detail. A desert patrol, the sharp bark of warning, the warmth of fur pressed against him during cold nights. He stepped closer to the cage, his voice barely above a whisper. "Max?" he said, his tone filled with disbelief. "Is it Leo?" The German shepherd slowly lifted his head at the sound of the name, his dark eyes locking onto Daniel's. But there was no flicker of recognition, no wagging tail or eager approach. His gaze was guarded, almost hollow, as if the world had taken too much from him. "He doesn't recognize me," Daniel murmured, his voice breaking. His chest tightened, a mix of heartache and guilt washing over him. He felt like a stranger to the dog who had once been his everything. Megan watched him carefully, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Do you know him?" she asked. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "He was my partner, my best friend." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. For a long moment, Daniel stood motionless, staring at the dog who had once saved his life in more ways than one. Max, or Leo, as Daniel would always know him, didn't move, his body tense and his eyes distant. "Would you like to spend some time with him?" Megan offered gently. "We have a play yard where you can sit with him." Daniel hesitated, unsure if he could bear the rejection again, but then he nodded, his resolve hardening. "Yeah, let's do that." As Megan opened the cage, Leo didn't bolt or growl, but his cautious demeanor spoke volumes. Daniel knelt a few feet away, giving him space. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "It's me, Daniel." Leo tilted his head slightly, a flicker of curiosity in his posture, but he stayed rooted in place. Daniel extended a hand, his voice trembling as he continued. "I don't know what you've been through, but I'm here, and I'm not giving up on you." For a fleeting moment, Leo's ears twitched, but he quickly retreated, his body language closed off. The distance between them felt insurmountable, but Daniel knew that giving up wasn't an option, not this time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in deep shadows, Daniel made his decision. He turned to Megan, his voice steady but resolute. "I'm taking him home. No matter how long it takes, I'll bring him back." Megan nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. "He's lucky to have you." Daniel wasn't sure about luck, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just rescuing Leo. He was rescuing himself. The drive home from the shelter was marked by an uneasy silence. Daniel sat behind the wheel, his grip firm on the steering wheel, while Max lay on the blanket in the truck bed, his body still and his eyes staring out the window. The Arizona desert stretched out endlessly on either side of the road, the sun casting long shadows as it began its descent. Daniel stole glances at Max in the rearview mirror, hoping for some sign of recognition, but the German shepherd remained distant, his posture rigid and unreadable. When Daniel finally pulled into the gravel driveway of his modest home on the outskirts of town, the tires crunched against the rocks, signaling their arrival. The house was small but sturdy, surrounded by a yard that was a mix of patchy grass and red dirt. It wasn't much, but it was home, a quiet place where Daniel hoped both he and Max could start to heal. Daniel parked the truck and stepped out, stretching briefly before moving to the back to open the tailgate. "Come on, Max," he said, his tone gentle but encouraging. Max hesitated, his ears twitching at the sound of Daniel's voice. After a moment, the dog rose to his feet and jumped down, landing with a soft thud on the ground. His movements were cautious, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. "This is it," Daniel said, motioning toward the house. "It's not much, but it's ours now." Max followed at a distance as Daniel led him to the front door, his steps slow and deliberate. Daniel had taken care to prepare the space for Max's arrival, setting up a corner of the living room with a brand new dog bed, food and water bowls, and a couple of toys he'd picked up on the way home. He opened the door and gestured for Max to enter. "Go ahead," he said softly. "Make yourself at home." Max stepped inside, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. His body remained tense, every muscle coiled as if ready to retreat at the slightest hint of danger. He ignored the inviting setup in the corner and instead stood near the doorway, his gaze fixed on the unfamiliar space. Daniel sighed, a mix of frustration and empathy swirling within him. "I get it," he said, setting his keys on the counter. "It's all new. You'll come around." He gave Max space, heading to the kitchen to prepare something simple for dinner. The rhythmic sound of chopping vegetables and the hiss of a pan filled the small house, blending with the occasional creak of the floorboards. Daniel glanced over his shoulder every now and then, watching Max from the corner of his eye. The dog hadn't moved from his spot near the door. As the evening wore on, Daniel decided to try again. He knelt down near the corner he had set up for Max, placing the food bowl closer to the dog's line of sight. "Here's some dinner," he said, his tone light and encouraging. "It's the good stuff, none of that shelter kibble." Max's ears twitched and he glanced at the bowl, but he made no move to approach. He simply stared at Daniel, his dark eyes betraying a mix of suspicion and confusion. Daniel's chest tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He understood all too well what it meant to distrust the world around you, to keep your guard up even when there was no immediate threat. "That's okay," Daniel murmured, standing up and backing away. "Take your time." Later that night, as the desert air grew cooler, Daniel settled into bed. He left the bedroom door open, a silent invitation for Max to come closer if he wanted. He lay in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the house settling. Just as he was beginning to drift off, he heard it, the soft pad of paws on the floor. He turned his head slightly, careful not to make any sudden movements. In the dim light filtering through the window, he could make out Max's silhouette standing just outside the doorway. The dog stood there for a moment, his body still and his gaze fixed on Daniel. Then slowly, Max lay down on the floor, his head resting on his paws. He kept a safe distance, but the gesture was enough to bring a small smile to Daniel's face. "Good night, Max," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. The next morning, Daniel woke to find Max sitting by the living room window, his ears perked as he watched the yard outside. The dog looked more at ease than he had the day before, though he still carried an air of caution. Daniel approached slowly, holding a fresh bowl of food. "Morning, buddy," he said, setting the bowl down a few feet away. "Thought we'd try again." Max glanced at the bowl, his nose twitching as he caught the scent of the meal. This time, after a moment of hesitation, he stood and walked over. He ate slowly, his eyes darting up to Daniel every few bites, as if ensuring he wasn't being watched too closely. Daniel stayed still, his heart lifting at the small progress. "That's it," he said softly. "No rush." As the day went on, Daniel tried to engage Max further, picking up a ball and rolling it across the floor. Max watched it go, his ears twitching at the sound, but he made no move to retrieve it. Daniel chuckled softly, picking up the ball again. "You'll come around," he said, tossing it lightly in his hand. In the afternoon, Daniel decided to take Max for a walk around the yard. He clipped a leash to Max's collar and led him outside, the warm sun casting long shadows across the red dirt. Max moved cautiously, his head low and his body tense, but he followed Daniel's lead. "We'll take it slow," Daniel said, his tone soothing. "One step at a time." As they walked, Daniel couldn't help but notice the way Max's ears perked up at certain sounds, the rustle of a bush, the distant call of a bird. There was a flicker of life in his movements, a hint of the dog he used to be. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Daniel hopeful. That evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of purple, Daniel sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching Max explore the yard. The dog moved with measured steps, his nose to the ground as he took in the sense of his new surroundings. Daniel smiled to himself, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. "We're getting there, buddy," he said, his voice low and steady. "Little by little." Max didn't respond, but he glanced back at Daniel briefly before returning to his exploration. It was a small gesture, but for Daniel, it spoke volumes. They were on their way, and that was all that mattered. The Arizona sun blazed overhead, casting golden light across Daniel's yard as he stood on the porch with a familiar object in his hands. An old military vest. Its fabric was worn but durable, and the faint smell of sand and sweat lingered, a reminder of missions long past. Daniel ran his fingers over the patches stitched onto the vest, badges of honor and hardship shared between him and Max. Holding it now, he hoped it might spark a memory buried within Max's guarded heart. Max was lying in the shade of a mesquite tree, his eyes half closed as he watched the world through a veil of detachment. Though his posture appeared relaxed, Daniel could see the tension in his limbs, the ever-present wariness that had yet to fade. With the vest in hand, Daniel took a deep breath and stepped off the porch. "Hey, Max," he called softly, his voice calm and inviting. Max's ears perked slightly, but he didn't move. His gaze flicked briefly to the vest, then back to Daniel. Undeterred, Daniel walked closer and crouched a few feet away, holding the vest out for Max to see. "Do you remember this?" he asked, his tone gentle but edged with hope. "We've been through a lot together, you and me." Max sniffed the air, catching the faint scent of the vest. His eyes seemed to narrow in thought, but he remained rooted to the spot. Daniel placed the vest on the ground between them, careful not to invade Max's space. He sat back on his heels, giving the dog time to process. For a long moment, Max simply stared at the vest. Then, tentatively, he stood and took a few cautious steps forward. He sniffed the fabric, his nose twitching as if trying to piece together a fragmented memory. Daniel watched in silence, his heart pounding as he waited for some sign of recognition. Just as quickly as Max had approached, he backed away, retreating to his spot beneath the tree. His tail was low, his body language stiff. Daniel sighed, a pang of disappointment tightening his chest, but he didn't let it show. He knew this process couldn't be rushed. "It's okay," he said softly, picking up the vest and brushing off the dust. "We'll try again later." Determined to reconnect with Max, Daniel spent the afternoon finding other ways to break down the barriers between them. He rummaged through his belongings until he found a small rubber ball, worn and scuffed from years of play. It had been one of Max's favorite toys during their downtime in the field, a simple object that had once brought them both a sense of normalcy amid chaos. Stepping into the yard, Daniel held up the ball for Max to see. "Remember this?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of nostalgia. "You used to chase this thing like it was the most important mission of your life." Max lifted his head, his ears twitching at the sound of Daniel's voice. He eyed the ball warily but didn't move. Daniel took a step back and rolled the ball across the ground, letting it come to a stop a few feet in front of Max. For a moment, Max's gaze followed the ball. His body tensed and Daniel thought he might go for it. But then the dog lowered his head back onto his paws, his eyes shifting away as if the effort were too much. Daniel sighed but refused to give up. He sat down on the porch steps, holding the ball in his hands. "I get it, buddy," he said, his voice tinged with empathy. "You're not ready yet, but I'm not going anywhere." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Daniel decided to try a different approach. He made dinner, setting aside a portion of cooked chicken for Max. Instead of placing the bowl on the floor and leaving, he knelt down and held the food out in his hand. "Here you go, boy," he said softly. "It's just me. No tricks." Max hesitated, his nose twitching as he caught the scent of the chicken. He took a cautious step forward, then another, until he was close enough to sniff Daniel's hand. Slowly, he opened his mouth and gently took a piece of chicken, retreating immediately to eat it at a safe distance. Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and hope. "That's it," he murmured. "We're getting somewhere." Over the next few days, Daniel continued to build on these small moments of connection. He spoke to Max often, sharing stories from their time together and voicing the thoughts that weighed on his mind. He told Max about the sleepless nights, the feeling of being adrift, and the emptiness that had lingered since leaving the army. "You're not the only one feeling lost," he admitted one evening as they sat on the porch together. Max lay a few feet away, his eyes half closed as he listened. "But maybe we can figure this out together." Daniel noticed that Max had begun to watch him more closely during these moments, his eyes holding a flicker of recognition. The dog still kept his distance, but there was a shift in his demeanor, a subtle softening that gave Daniel hope. One afternoon, as Daniel was tossing the ball absent-mindedly in the yard, Max surprised him. The German shepherd stood up and took a few hesitant steps toward the ball, his body language cautious but curious. Daniel froze, his breath catching as he watched Max sniff the ball. "You want it?" he asked, his voice low and encouraging. Max hesitated, then picked up the ball in his mouth. He turned and walked back toward the tree, dropping the ball at its base before lying down again. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Daniel's chest tighten with emotion. "That's my boy," he said quietly, a smile breaking across his face. Each day brought new, albeit small, breakthroughs. Max began following Daniel around the yard, his steps tentative but deliberate. He allowed Daniel to sit closer to him during their quiet moments on the porch, and he started to wag his tail faintly whenever Daniel spoke to him. One night, as Daniel was settling into bed, he heard the now familiar sound of paws on the floor. He looked toward the doorway and saw Max standing there, his silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of moonlight. This time, instead of staying at the threshold, Max walked into the room and lay down beside the bed. Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and determination. "We're getting there, buddy," he said softly, reaching down to rest a hand on Max's back. For the first time, Max didn't flinch at the touch. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was progress, slow, steady, and meaningful. Together, Daniel and Max were beginning to rebuild the bond that war and time had tried to break. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Daniel started the day by preparing a breakfast that he hoped would tempt Max. He diced some chicken into his dog's kibble and added a splash of broth, creating a meal designed to win even the most reluctant eater's approval. Placing the bowl near Max's usual spot, Daniel didn't walk away this time. Instead, he sat a few feet away, giving Max space while still staying within sight. "Come on, buddy," Daniel said softly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "It's just you and me here." Max eyed him warily, but eventually crept forward. He sniffed the bowl, his tail low but wagging faintly, a sign of tentative interest. Daniel held his breath as Max took his first bite, chewing slowly while keeping a cautious eye on Daniel. When Max finished the meal, Daniel smiled and resisted the urge to move closer. "That's my boy," he murmured. It wasn't much, but it felt like a victory. Later that day, Daniel decided to try a walk. Max had shown interest in exploring the yard, so Daniel hoped venturing beyond the property might spark further curiosity. He found Max's old military ID tag and collar, cleaned them, and attached them to a new leash. "Let's take it easy," Daniel said as he crouched near Max, holding the leash out for him to see. "We're just going to take a look around." Max hesitated when Daniel clipped the leash to his collar, his ears flattening slightly as if expecting the worst. But Daniel's calm demeanor seemed to reassure him. With a gentle tug, Daniel encouraged Max toward the gate, and after a few seconds of hesitation, the German shepherd followed. The walk was slow and cautious, each step a reminder of how far they both had come. Max sniffed the air, his nose twitching at every unfamiliar scent while his eyes darted around the surroundings. Daniel spoke softly as they walked, recounting stories from their time in the army. "Remember that time you stole my sandwich during training? You didn't even try to hide it," Daniel said with a chuckle. "The look on your face was priceless." Max didn't respond, of course, but his ears twitched, and Daniel liked to believe the sound of his voice brought some sense of comfort. As the day wound down, Daniel and Max sat on the porch together, a quiet companionship settling between them. Max lay at Daniel's feet, his body relaxed but alert. Daniel gazed out at the horizon, his thoughts drifting back to the battlefields where they had first forged their bond. "You know, Max," Daniel said, breaking the silence, "we both came back with scars. Yours might be easier to see, but that doesn't make mine any less real." Max's ears perked up slightly, and Daniel took it as a sign to continue. "But maybe that's the point. We don't have to carry all this alone. We've got each other." Max didn't respond, of course, but the faint wag of his tail and the way he tilted his head toward Daniel felt like acknowledgement. For the first time in a long while, Daniel allowed himself to believe that healing was possible. Not just for Max, but for himself as well. Max had been with him for weeks now, and though progress was slow, Daniel felt a shift. The guarded dog, who had once cowered in corners, now followed him around the house, though still at a cautious distance. Each small victory strengthened Daniel's resolve to break through the walls of fear and pain that surrounded Max. Today, Daniel decided to try something new, something that had defined their partnership in the past. He would use the whistle, a tool that had once been a cornerstone of their training and bond. Daniel stood in the yard, the morning air still cool and crisp. He held the whistle in his hand, its metal surface worn smooth from years of use. It was the same whistle he'd used during their military days, a simple yet powerful tool that had once been a lifeline for communication between him and Max. "Let's see if this stirs something, buddy," Daniel murmured as he clipped it to his lanyard. Max lay in the shade of a mesquite tree, his eyes tracking Daniel's movements. He was alert, but calm, a stark contrast to the tense, unapproachable demeanor he had exhibited when he first arrived. Daniel took a deep breath and blew 2 short bursts on the whistle, a command they had practiced countless times during their missions. The sound cut through the stillness of the yard, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. Max's ears perked up and his head tilted slightly. He stood up, his body tense but not frightened. Daniel's heart raced as he watched the German shepherd take a hesitant step toward him, his gaze fixed on the source of the sound. "Good boy," Daniel said softly, his voice steady but full of encouragement. Max paused, sniffing the air as if trying to place the memory the sound evoked. Then cautiously, he took another step forward. It wasn't much, but to Daniel it was monumental. Encouraged by Max's reaction, Daniel decided to build on the moment. He reached for the rubber ball, the same one Max had begun to show interest in days earlier. Holding it up for Max to see, Daniel gave a familiar command. "Fetch!" He tossed the ball a few feet away, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Max watched the ball roll across the yard, his body stiff with hesitation. For a moment, Daniel thought he wouldn't move. Then, as if something inside him clicked, Max trotted toward the ball, picked it up in his mouth, and turned back toward Daniel. Daniel's breath caught as Max approached, his tail wagging slightly. When Max dropped the ball at his feet, Daniel crouched down, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. "That's my boy," he said, his voice filled with emotion. He gently reached out to pick up the ball, and Max didn't pull away. They repeated the game several times, each throw building Max's confidence. By the 4th or 5th toss, Max was bounding after the ball with a level of energy Daniel hadn't seen in weeks. His tail wagged more freely, and his eyes held a spark of life that had been absent since their reunion. After their game of fetch, Daniel decided to revisit some of their old training routines. He knew the commands might trigger more memories for Max, reinforcing their bond. "Sit," Daniel said, holding up his hand. Max hesitated but eventually obeyed, lowering his body into a seated position. Daniel's smile widened. "Good boy," he praised, reaching into his pocket to offer Max a small treat. Max accepted it, his eyes meeting Daniel's for the briefest of moments. "Let's try something else," Daniel said, standing up. He gave a whistle command followed by the word, "Stay." Max froze in place, his body tense but compliant. As Daniel walked a few steps away, Max stayed rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on Daniel. "Come," Daniel called, his tone encouraging. Max hesitated for a heartbeat, then padded over to Daniel, his steps cautious but deliberate. When he reached Daniel, the veteran knelt down, unable to hide the pride and emotion in his expression. "You're doing great, Max," he said, his voice thick. "I knew you were still in there." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel sat on the porch with Max by his side. The day's progress had been extraordinary, and Daniel felt a renewed sense of hope. For the first time, Max seemed at ease, his body relaxed as he rested at Daniel's feet. The veteran reached down, placing a hand gently on Max's head. Max flinched slightly but didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, his eyes closing as if savoring the moment. "You've got no idea how much this means to me, buddy," Daniel whispered. "We're going to be okay. Both of us." As the stars began to dot the night sky, Max shifted closer, resting his head on Daniel's knee. The gesture was simple but profound, a sign that the barriers between them were finally breaking down. That night, Daniel lay in bed with the door open as always. He didn't expect anything different, but as he drifted off to sleep, he felt a familiar presence at the foot of the bed. Opening his eyes, he saw Max lying there, his body relaxed and his breathing steady. "Good night, Max," Daniel murmured, his voice filled with gratitude. As sleep overtook him, Daniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The bond between him and Max was healing, piece by piece. And for the first time since leaving the army, Daniel believed they both had a future worth looking forward to. Together. The sun rose over the Arizona landscape, its warm rays painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Daniel stood in his modest kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee, his gaze shifting to the backyard where Max lay in the grass, his ears perked and alert. It was a far cry from the withdrawn and wounded dog Daniel had brought home weeks ago. Max now moved with purpose, his eyes brighter, his demeanor more engaged. Today was special, a milestone in their journey. Daniel had decided to take Max to a nearby park, a place that held memories of their training days. It would be their first outing together since Max had come home, a symbol of how far they had come. Daniel loaded Max into the back seat of his truck, the once distant dog now hopping in with an ease that brought a smile to Daniel's face. As they drove, the desert landscape blurred past the windows, and Daniel caught glimpses of Max sniffing the air, his tail wagging faintly. "Almost there, buddy," Daniel said, glancing at Max through the rearview mirror. The dog met his gaze briefly, a connection that felt deeper than words. When they arrived at the park, Daniel stepped out and opened the truck door. Max jumped down, his movements steady and confident. Daniel clipped on his leash, and together they made their way toward the open field where the early morning light cast long shadows across the grass. The park was quiet, with only a few joggers and dog walkers in the distance. Daniel led Max to a secluded spot under a sprawling oak tree, setting down a small bag he had packed with essentials, water, treats, and Max's favorite ball. Taking a deep breath, Daniel pulled out the ball and held it up. "Ready, Max?" The German shepherd's ears perked up and his body tensed with anticipation. Daniel threw the ball, watching as Max sprinted after it with an energy he hadn't seen in years. The sight made Daniel's chest swell with emotion. Max returned with the ball, his tail wagging furiously. He dropped it at Daniel's feet and barked, a sound filled with joy and eagerness. "Good boy," Daniel said, laughing as he tossed the ball again. For the next hour they played together, the rhythm of their movements echoing the routines of their training days. Each throw and fetch felt like a piece of their shared past being restored. Daniel couldn't help but marvel at how much Max had changed. He was no longer the broken dog who had cowered in corners. He was vibrant, alive, and, most importantly, trusting. As the morning wore on, Daniel and Max took a break under the oak tree. Max lay beside Daniel, his head resting on his paws, while Daniel leaned back against the trunk, sipping from a bottle of water. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" Daniel said, scratching Max behind the ears. The dog closed his eyes, a contented sigh escaping him. Daniel's mind drifted to the day he had found Max at the shelter. He thought about the emptiness in Max's eyes, the pain and fear that had built walls around him. Seeing Max now, relaxed and happy, was a testament to their journey together. They had both been broken in their own ways, but they had found healing in each other. "You saved me too, you know," Daniel whispered. Max opened one eye as if acknowledging the sentiment and nudged Daniel's hand with his nose. As they sat quietly, a jogger with a Labrador retriever approached. The man paused, his dog wagging its tail enthusiastically as it eyed Max. "Beautiful shepherd you've got there," the man said. "Thanks," Daniel replied, giving Max a pat on the back. "He's been through a lot, but he's a fighter." The man nodded, a knowing smile on his face. Sometimes they teach us more about resilience than we teach them. After exchanging a few pleasantries, the jogger moved on, leaving Daniel to reflect on those words. He glanced at Max, who was now watching a bird flit from branch to branch. It was true. Max's journey had been a lesson in patience, trust, and the power of second chances. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Daniel decided it was time to head home. He packed up their belongings and clipped Max's leash back on. Before leaving, he knelt down and looked Max in the eyes. "You've given me more than I could ever repay, Max," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "From now on, we face everything together. No more loneliness, no more fear, just you and me." Max wagged his tail, leaning into Daniel's hand as it rested on his head. It was as if he understood every word. The drive home was quiet, but the silence was comforting. Daniel couldn't help but smile as he watched Max through the rearview mirror. The bond they had rebuilt felt unshakable, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of purpose and peace. Back at the house, Max jumped out of the truck and trotted to the front door, his movements confident and sure. Inside, Daniel set down their things and watched as Max curled up on his bed, a look of contentment on his face. As Daniel sat down on the couch, Max got up and lay beside him, resting his head on Daniel's lap. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a depth of meaning that words couldn't capture. That night, as the desert stars filled the sky, Daniel sat on the porch with Max at his side. The journey to this moment had been long and challenging, but it had been worth every step. "We're going to be okay, Max," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because we've got each other." Max nudged his hand in response, his tail thumping softly against the porch floor. Together they gazed out at the vast expanse of the desert, ready to face whatever came next. Side by side. The story of Daniel and Max is more than a tale of reunion. It's a testament to resilience, the power of patience, and the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. Both had experienced trauma that left scars, visible and invisible, and yet, in each other, they found the strength to heal. Max, once a loyal war dog, had endured the loss of trust and familiarity, while Daniel struggled with the void left by his military service. Their journey together wasn't easy, filled with moments of doubt and quiet setbacks, but it was those very challenges that deepened their bond. Through persistence and love, Daniel rediscovered his sense of purpose, and Max found his way back to the spirited, trusting dog he once was. Together, they proved that even the deepest wounds can be mended when faced with compassion and determination. Their story reminds us that healing often requires time and vulnerability, but it's a journey worth taking. The connection between Daniel and Max didn't just mend their broken hearts, it gave them a future filled with hope, loyalty, and companionship. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales of resilience and the unbreakable bonds that make life meaningful. Together, let's celebrate the healing power of love and the extraordinary partnerships that change our lives.